Good afternoon, everybody. I know that among you there are some of you who have already some experience in the ed system, and some of you don't, but might be interested in joining this field. So I'm going to focus mostly on this issue of gaining humanitarian space, but I'm more than happy at the end both to have you challenge me on our perception, but also to answer some questions regarding how to engage with an organization like MSF, and some questions that you may have as you are about to embark in a new professional life. So I thought that was a good time when I was invited for this lecture to share with you some of the reflections that we're having at the moment within the organization, and trying to share and engage the aid actors on. And it's this issue of humanitarian space, which is a word that we hear all the time, but what does it mean exactly, and what does it mean to claim a right for humanitarian space? In recent years, as you may know, there's been a growing concerns among aid workers about a possible loss of humanitarian space. And this was called the shrinking humanitarian space that appeared in a series of articles and research material. And most of this shrinking of humanitarian space was actually attributed to what we also called, and became famous, the blurring of the lines. The blurring of the lines between military actors, humanitarian actors, between development or human rights organizations and humanitarian emergency organizations, to the extent that there was a feeling that we could no longer distinguish themselves from belligerents and from other actors, and also to the extent that there was such a mix in the political, security, military agenda that it was extremely challenging for an organization to gain acceptance. And acceptance has been over the year one of the key elements of both access and security for humanitarian organizations, because we believe, at least this is a strong belief in MSF, that we are better protected by acceptance than by an armed escort. And we have an exception to this rule, which is Somalia, where we have not been able to operate without armed escort. But in every other countries, we believe that it's better to work at being known by the different parties to the conflict, by the communities, have them understand what we do, make sure that what we do is what we say, and that there is no gaps between what we do and the way we are perceived. And that the protection of the community and the acceptance from the community that we're really impartial, that is, that we are providing indiscriminately the medical care, was the best protection. So this blurring of the lines with a growing humanitarian sector involving governments, involving even private organizations, corporates, involving a lot of different AIDS organizations with different mandate and mission, has become really the issue responsible for losing the space and for all the security issues and security incidents that in fact have increased. There is no doubt about that, and MSF does not question the fact that there are more incidents and security issues than there used to be in the past, which in the end results in less access, because if we don't manage to guarantee a certain level of security for our staff, it's clear that we're not going to develop operations. We're not going to sacrifice our patients and our colleagues just for the sake of helping others or saving new lives. So this is to say that in this whole debate around humanitarian, shrinking of the humanitarian space, blurring of the line, MSF was also questioning this and was part of these concerns. And there has been a lot of discussions internally in MSF about what this means and how MSF should position itself. And I will talk to you a bit later about a campaign that is actually going to kick off in a couple of weeks around this. But we shared this concern, and not only because it was a general observation from our part, but also because we were directly affected by this issue. And it started in 2008, and in the course of 2008, 2009, MSF was expelled from Niger. We had one section expelled from Darfur, following the indictment of President Bashir by the International Criminal Court. We faced tremendous difficulties to negotiate access in Sri Lanka during the last military offensive against the LTTE. And of course, not to mention all the barriers to access that we have in Somalia or in Yemen even now. So there were very practical reasons that made us think that, yes, there was an issue, and it started to develop a sort of traumatic thinking, and in the whole organization, in the psyche of the organization, people started to be very reluctant to speak out, and they were afraid of losing the operational capacity, and it was becoming really, really tense. So this is how we engage in this whole reflection about the humanitarian space. And it started with a counter-argument that was, never before has there been so many resources devoted to aid. And I did a presentation on Monday about global health. And so I found the figures. In 1990, there was $5.6 billion devoted to global health. And in 2010, it was $26 billion. So we're only talking about global health. We're not talking even about all the aid system. But it's really an important indicator, and I think it shows how significant the mobilization of the international community around aid and in resource-limited countries has been. And MSF was no exception to this rule, because we started 40 years ago as a very small organization, and we're now a $1 billion organization worldwide. And as we speak, there are 27,000 colleagues working in the field in more than 60 countries. So no doubt that we have expanded a lot. So there's a sort of incongruity in saying that our humanitarian space is shrinking, and at the same time that there are more actors, more resources, and our programs are very large scale. In 24 years ago, when we were operating in Afghanistan during the Soviet occupations, we had a team of maybe 3 people who were crossing from Peshawar. They would spend 6 months in the mountains in Afghanistan, and they were one of our key programs, but we might have treated maybe 30 or 40 patients a month, right? Now we treat patients by the hundreds every day in our HIV programs, in nutrition programs, etc. So there's really a difficulty to mentally accept that the space is shrinking. So what we did was to look at our previous experience of the past, not of the last 10 years, not the experience of the last 20 years, but really over these 4 or 5 years, how has been MSF space exactly? How have we gained this space in very practical situations? So a group of researchers in MSF started to look at very concrete case studies, concrete examples. They look at Myanmar, they look at Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, India, South Africa, and try to analyze how and which space had been gained, and what are the compromises and the results that we had managed to obtain through this. And can we really say that this space has been shrinking? So for example, in Myanmar, they looked at the 20 years of medical diplomacy that we've had there, to the point that today we have managed to we treat about 75% of the HIV cases. On the other hand, it's been a very controversial program in MSF, because a lot of us believe that we were making too much compromise in Myanmar. Actually, we've accepted not to work in certain areas. We've constantly tried to work in some states that we knew were affected by malaria, but we never gained the authorization. But we decided, however, to stay in Myanmar, which was different, for example, in North Korea, when we were not able to reach some areas where we thought the population was more vulnerable, and we decided to withdraw from North Korea. So what we realized is that for every single situation, there is a different space of work, and there are different levels of compromises that we have made. And the MSF colleagues who started this research came actually to the conclusion that humanitarian space is not a right that you claim by virtue of being, you know, a so-called pure humanitarian actor. The space that we gain in every situation is the result of the negotiation that always leads to some degree of compromise. And this negotiation, in order to be successful and to allow some space, also involved a certain degree of, how can I say, of interest from the other party. That is, you will never get access in a country if this country has no interest anyway in having you there. So that's an interesting aspect, because it means that claiming, I mean, we don't deny the fact and we don't question the fact that there is a right to humanitarian action. That's for sure, and it's a right that is defined by international humanitarian law. But we question the fact of an organization coming to a certain area and asking for or claiming a right to be here and doing this. And we believe that this is the responsibility of the organization to actually conquer its own space of work through action and through negotiation, and also leading to a certain number of compromises. And this compromise, and what we see through the different case studies, is that this compromise can take different forms. They can take the form of accepting limited access. Myanmar is one example, as I said earlier. But Pakistan also, we are doing large operations in Pakistan. But over the past 3 years, we've continuously tried to gain access to Waziristan province with no success. The Pakistani military would not let us reach this area. So there are definitely some compromises that we make in not being able to reach every single area. Recently I returned from China, where we have several operational alternatives, and one of them was to provide HIV/AIDS treatment in Yunnan province. This is a province where we have a long history. We started with prevention like 20 years ago, and there's a great acceptance, but there are still lots of needs because there is a high prevalence there. And what was of interest for MSF was actually to be able to have programs at the border with Myanmar, because we're also following the population of Myanmar. And the Chinese did not agree with us. They were okay with us working on HIV/AIDS inside the Yunnan province, but not in this specific area. So the Dutch section was interested in following up Myanmar, declined the offer, and we're going to look at other possibilities. So this is to say that limited access and geographical access mostly is sometimes what is part of the negotiation and the compromise we make. Ensuring limited visibility is the second form of the compromise that we can make. For example, in India, and I didn't show you the book that actually provide in details all these case studies. In India, we've had to negotiate not just with the Indian government, and maybe this is the sign of the recent developments, but also with the civil society. And in South Africa it was the same. Negotiation, it's not always with military actors, with belligerents, with states. You also have to convince the civil society that is emerging in some countries that there is a sort of acceptance of your approach. And the problem in India was for us to convince the Right to Food movement to utilize this ready-to-use therapeutic food that we thought was extremely instrumental in addressing malnutrition. And the compromise that we had to make was actually to keep a very low profile. So in the end, they let us work and they let us provide some malnutrition, some ready-to-use therapeutic food, but it was clear that we needed to keep a very, very low visibility in the area where we worked. So this is the sort of compromise that we make. Or another compromise that is the most difficult for the teams is, of course, to remain silent. That is, you stay, you work, but you shut up. And there has always been a tension between bearing witness, témoignage, as we call it, and being operational on the ground. But it has reached certainly a very high level in recent years, especially with Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is certainly for us the most traumatic experience of the recent years, when we had to make the choice of staying. Well, we made the choice. We didn't have to make this choice, but we had to make one possible choice between providing medical care during the military offensive and not being able to speak out about the situation, and most notably about the violence that was going on in Sri Lanka and the indiscriminate violence against Sri Lankan citizens by the Sri Lankan authorities. It has completely divided the organization. Still now, we are arguing internally about this. I personally believe that we were wrong. We should have tried to, even ICRC was more vocal than we were. But this is the choice we've made. We're facing the following situation. The army was launching the last military offensive, and in Vani, and we received a very, very large number of very wounded people. So we provided surgical activity, and we're treating patients by the hundreds. So the argument has been at that time, we are making a huge medical difference by being there. Even though these patients are referred, even though we're not inside the Vani, but at least we're making a huge difference. And if we speak out, because speaking out for us would have meant reacting based on the medical consequences of the violence, right? We knew, we could see children, victims of bombings, etc. And the Sri Lankan government made it clear that and they asked us to, in the MOU, to include a provision, because we have an MOU with every country where we work, to include a provision that any communication would be green-lighted about Sri Lanka would be green-lighted by them. So we decided to sign it. We did not speak out. We informed about the situation, but there was no real témoignage or advocacy from people. But it was right or not, but it's just to say that this was the result of the negotiation. This is how we gain space, and it involved a high degree of compromise. So what one of the lessons also that we've learned in looking at this negotiation is that, at least for us, what is clear is that there is a persistent pattern all throughout the different negotiations that we've made. And this pattern has actually helped MSF define where the red line was for us. What is acceptable, what is not acceptable. And this pattern is that compromise is always driven by the expected benefit for the patients. It's not driven by the political gain for MSF. It's really about should we accept this compromise based on the fact that we will have a significant medical impact. And this is helpful, although it forces us to sometimes accept that operations prevail over témoignage, which is not necessarily something that is acknowledged all throughout the organization. But at least it helps us define the red line. And this is helpful also because what is clear is that there's no definition for this red light. You don't know where it stands, but what you know is that if you have a very limited medical impact, you're going to accept a lower level of risk than if you make a real difference. This is why, for example, in Somalia, we have accepted armed guards, because the needs are so huge in Somalia, right? At the moment, we're running we are piloting a malaria program in Mali. And this is a very interesting and very innovative approach, using malaria prophylaxis before the rainy season, before the epidemics, to actually decrease, demonstrate that we can decrease incidence of malaria. So it's super interesting from a scientific standpoint. If we demonstrate that it works, it will have major consequences in terms of influencing the protocols. But on the other hand, if the situation deteriorates in Mali in terms of security, and if there aren't major humanitarian needs, needless to say that we are not going to keep this program and put our teams in danger. So this is to say that it really depends on the medical benefit that you are expected to have. There is another example that is not in the book, but that I have experienced some years ago. When we decided, I think it was in 1994, to leave Goma in the middle of a cholera outbreak, you may argue that, well, there were major needs, right? And MSF, however, decided to withdraw from the camp, considering that the camp had been under the control of the Interamwe, which were the militias that had been responsible for in the genocide in Rwanda. And despite this cholera outbreak, MSF decided to withdraw, because we thought that we were actually just strengthening these factions. Actually, when you think about it, there were maybe hundreds of different NGOs in the camps at that time. So there was no major medical risk for us to leave. And I would argue cynically that if we had been alone in the camp, maybe we wouldn't have left. And we are very happy that other organizations were able and willing to continue, so that we could take our very high stance and moral posture in face of the diversion of space in Goma camp. So this is to say that, again, I think even unconsciously, our decision to leave Goma was also guided by the fact that the needs were covered anyway without us. So you might say, so does it mean that MSF has been arguing for years for the principles of impartiality, independence, neutrality, is now getting rid of these principles and adopting a much more pragmatic approach and much less principled? Yes and no. I will start with the no. I think that what shows, what this retrospective analysis shows, is that there's one thing we've never lost, and that is key to our choices, is the capacity, the independence of judgment, the capacity to decide whether or not a compromise is acceptable. And for this, we have all the necessary basis for independence, because we are financially independent, and therefore we can make some decisions based on medical needs only, even though we accept some level of compromise sometimes. And I would say yes, in the sense that when you look at MSF position in the and trends in its history, and we celebrated last year our 40 years anniversary, MSF identity has very much depended on the context where we evolved. MSF was born in the middle of the Cold War, and it was a very bipolar environment. To some extent, it was much more simple, because there were only two sides, and we just had to take one. And we didn't even take one when you think about it. We just denounced totalitarian regimes. MSF started responding to the needs from displaced people, the boat people, mostly from communist countries. And our main operations were taking care of Cambodian, Vietnamese refugees, etc. So, and for us, it was this first decade of the 80s was actually to denounce totalitarian regimes, but also to denounce the perversion of aid, as we did in Ethiopia in these years. And then, looking at the 90s, MSF this new international disorder, and took position we actively in the Bosnian debate. We asked for military intervention in Rwanda. We initially supported it, even though now we say we don't want to take part in this discussion. And then we soon realized that actually this involvement, these solutions and this involvement was not a remedy to the humanitarian crisis. So that led in the 2000 to a very different posture from MSF, and I think that this research is also in the same line. We actually have to take from all the instruments that are not providing solutions and that are just creating more confusion. We wanted to reaffirm our neutrality in the conflict. And this took different forms. Our position regarding the R2P, the responsibility to protect. We're not against, of course, the responsibility to protect, but we are against the fact that NGOs or humanitarian actors should call for R2P. And the reason is that if you call for R2P, then you call for the using force. And using force at some stage involves a degree of violence, which is completely incompatible with humanitarian action, which is by definition to alleviate suffering. And all the examples of armed intervention in the name of protection of civilians have actually had some collateral effects for the civilians. So it has created some form of violence. That might be necessary, but we believe it's not the role of humanitarian actors to ask for it. We also think that in the case of R2P, calling for intervention means naming one good side and one bad side, because you're going to have to act under the protection of this side, right? It's exactly like a humanitarian corridor. You are asking to militarize humanitarian aid, and therefore you face more risk being targeted if you try to mix these two approaches. In the ICC debate, MSF also thinks that this is not the role of an organization. If we want to build acceptance in the ground, if we want to carve our space for communities, at the same time asking for the International Criminal Courts to indict some of the people and the factions that we are exposed to is a risk for us in terms of acceptance. So we are taking a much more pragmatic approach than in the past. And the issue on humanitarian space and negotiation is part of this posture. So just one more example to show you how the organization has evolved, and to acknowledge that we are really trying to do some critical self-reflection about us, and also to adapt. You know, it's not because we've taken one stance we should keep it. We want to be able to evolve with the environment. In 1999, when James Orbinski was the president of MSF, received the Nobel Peace Prize, we are very surprised by this peace prize, because we always claimed that we were not a peace actor. We were not working at peace. So on the other hand, it would have been really but and there was at that time 200,000 euros attached to it. So we decided to use it to do some advocacy and to shed a light on one issue we were particularly worried about, which was about Grozny and the bombing in Chechnya. And so James made a speech, and I think we are not certain mentioned that by speaking we will be able to save lives, but we know for sure that silence kills. So that was in 1999. And in one of the chapters of this book, where we try to look at how MSF has evolved in its approach to speaking out, Fabrice is one of the researchers. You might know Fabrice, Alex? Yes. Silence and speech. So it shows how the organization is looking ironically at itself for describing our decisions to compromise. So I will just finish with this by saying that, and then we open the floor maybe for discussion. We're not claiming that there is no right for humanitarian action, and we believe that we absolutely need to work at preserving this space. There is indeed a real danger in losing that space and in not being able to reach the population that are most in distress. And ICRC is going to organize in a couple of days, launch a campaign on healthcare called Healthcare in Danger. And they've asked us to participate in this campaign, and we definitely want to participate in raising awareness about the absolute need to respect medical care, humanitarian space, and the health facilities. And talking about health facilities, I think that it's important to acknowledge that it's easier for MSF than for other organizations to actually claim this humanitarian space, because we've chosen to focus mostly on emergencies, on medical activity. There is a lot of similarities between the medical ethics and the humanitarian principles. It's much more complicated for an organization who also engage more in construction and who have multi-mandate agendas. We don't think I think we've come a long way from saying this is not humanitarian to saying, well, they are part of the community anyway. We have to deal with this. There is a very large variety of actors, and I don't think it's the right way to go by just saying there is a good or a real humanitarian, a pure humanitarian, and a non-pure humanitarian, because it would mean that there would be just only a very few organizations who are truly independent. Honestly, there aren't many, and it's very difficult, more and more, including for us. We are supporting a lot of HIV/AIDS programs. Our programs are completely integrated in the national health policy. So are we truly independent? Certainly not, and we have to comply with a lot of protocols and policies. So I think I don't have the answer, but the debate really needs to evolve and needs to be much more nuanced that it used to be. This means for us to acknowledge that everyone has a role to play and a meaningful role to play in humanitarian, but it means also for a lot of actors maybe to raise a little bit the bar, to put the bar higher in terms of the level of compromise and independence that they are ready to have. So I will stop here, and maybe we can open the floor for questions.